inspiring a conservative Republican backlash that would gain political control during the 1980s. The Great Society programs did, however, include several great successes. Infant mortality has dropped, college completion rates have soared, malnutrition has virtually disappeared, and far fewer elderly Americans live below the poverty line without access to health care. The federal guarantee of civil rights and voting rights remain in place. Medicare and Medicaid have become two of the most appreciated government programs. Head Start programs providing preschool enrichment activities for poor students have produced long-term benefits. The federal food stamp program has improved the nutrition and health of children living in poverty. And finally, scholarships for low-income college students have been immensely valuable, providing access to higher education. Several of Johnson's more ambitious programs, however, were ill-conceived. Others were vastly underfunded, and many were mismanaged or even corrupt. Some of these problems that they were meant to address actually worsened. Overall, the Great Society programs helped reduce the population living in poverty from 19% in 1964 to 10% in 1973. But it did so largely by providing federal welfare payments and not by finding people decent, well-paying jobs. In 1966, middle-class resentment over the costs and accessibility of the Great Society programs generated a conservative backlash that fueled the Republican resurgence in Congress. By then, however, the Great Society had transformed Americans' expectations of the power and the role of the federal government. And consequently, most of these programs have remained in place. So even at its peak in the 1960s, liberalism faced major challenges from both the left and the right. In this lecture, we're going to talk mostly about the challenge from the left, and in the coming lectures, we will talk about the challenge from the right. On the left, a generation of young activists, mainly in colleges and universities, became impatient with what they saw as the slow pace of social progress and were increasingly disturbed by the escalation of the Vietnam War. At the same time, the right contended that liberals had instituted reforms that diminished individual initiative and benefited racial minorities at the expense of the white middle class. They criticized liberals for not winning the Vietnam War and depicted the left as unpatriotic and out of step with mainstream American values. By 1969, liberalism and the left were in retreat, and Richard Nixon, a political conservative, had captured the White House, which we will talk about more next week. But the civil rights movement had inspired many young people to activism. Combining ideals of freedom, equality, and community with direct action protest, civil rights activists offered a model for those seeking to address a variety of problems, including the Cold War threat of nuclear devastation, the loss of individual autonomy in a corporate society, racism, poverty, sexism, and the degradation of the environment. Many idealistic young people decided that they could no longer turn a blind eye to the growing evidence of injustice and inequality. A full-fledged youth revolt erupted during the mid-60s. As criticism of U.S. military involvement in Vietnam increased, disillusioned young people flowed into two distinct, yet frequently overlapping movements, the New Left and the counterculture. The New Left was the more intellectual of the two groups. Central to this evolving ideology was the Students for Democratic Society, which advocated the formation of a new left. So they considered the old left, which revolved around the Communist Party during the 1930s, as autocratic. They viewed them as no longer relevant. So the Students for Democratic Society condemned mainstream liberal politics, Cold War foreign policy, racism, and the military-industrial complex. So they really shifted their view away from this anti-communist hysteria. It's important to note, however, that the New Left never consisted of one central organization. After all, many protesters challenged the very idea of centralized authority. And so we see here, this would be the counterculture, and this is the New Left. So So the Vietnam War accelerated student radicalism, and college campuses provided a strategic setting for anti-war activities. To be fair, the Vietnam War was primarily a poor man's fight. Most college students were able to postpone military service until they received their degree or reached the age of 24. In 1965 and 1966, students made up only 2% of those drafted to serve. Black Americans and Hispanic Americans were twice as likely to be drafted as whites. Like most Americans in the mid-1960s, undergraduates at the beginning of the war only had a dim awareness of U.S. activity in Vietnam. Yet all college men were eligible for the draft once they graduated and lost their student deferment. As more troops were sent to Vietnam, student concerns intensified. As the war dragged on, Americans divided into hawks and doves, those who supported the war and those who opposed it. Some 200,000 young men ignored their draft notices, and some 4,000 served prison sentences for doing so. Others ceremoniously burned their draft cards in front of television cameras. The most popular means of escaping the draft was to find a way to flunk the physical examination. The majority of Americans initially supported the war in Vietnam. Public opinion polls indicated that the majority of Americans supported until about 1968. So for much of the war, anti-war protesters were initially a pretty vocal minority, but by the late 1960s, most Americans had turned against the war in Vietnam. The Vietnam War, more than any other event, spelled the dissolution of the liberal consensus. This included the civil rights movement. After 1965, King increasingly criticized the Johnson administration for waging war in Vietnam and failing to fight the war on poverty more vigorously at home. In 1968, King prepared to mount a massive Poor People's March on Washington when he was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was supporting demonstrations for striking sanitation workers. During the late 1960s, a group of disaffected young rebels, the so-called hippies, embraced the counterculture, an unorganized rebellion against mainstream institutions, values, and behavior that focused more on cultural change than political activism. Both the counterculture and the New Left fiercely rejected the status quo, but most hippies preferred to drop out of mainstream society rather than try to change the political system. Like the Beats of the 50s, the Beatniks, hippies created their own subculture that promoted personal freedom from virtually all traditional constraints. They rejected the authority of the nation's sore institutions, including the nuclear family, the government, political parties, corporations, the military, and colleges and universities. So a lot of this stuff that we talked about in our last lecture on the 1950s. Or I guess that was a few lectures ago. The hippies rejected the pursuit of wealth, careers, and the pursuit of material comfort, and embraced plain living, authenticity, friendship, peace, and especially freedom. The counterculture lifestyle included an array of popular ideals and activities, including peace, love, harmony, rock music, mystical religions, sexual freedom, communal living, and of course, a ton of mind-altering drugs, especially psychedelics. So we're going to pause here with a reflection. How did the New Left differ from the Old Left? And how did they differ from the hippie counterculture that emerged?